Imagine a car that looks like a fighter jet, powered not by a regular engine, but by a roaring gas turbine spinning at 26,000 revolutions per minute. A car so futuristic that it blurred the line between the road and the runway. This wasn't science fiction. It was the General Motors Firebird I, a one-of-a-kind experiment that promised to bring the jet age straight to the highway. Today, we're diving deep into the story of the GM Firebird I, one of the most daring concept cars ever built. When we step back into the early 1950s, it was a world consumed by the jet age. Fighter planes breaking the sound barrier, the Cold War accelerating technology, and engineers daring to imagine a future where the power of turbines could be adapted to everyday life. Automotives were not immune to this fascination. The traditional piston engine was already reaching new limits, but visionaries wanted to leap into a future that felt like science fiction. General Motors was at the forefront of this bold thinking. Under the leadership of Charles L. McEwen and the GM Research Laboratories, the company had been experimenting with gas turbines, intrigued by their compact design, reliability at high RPMs, and sheer power output. Yet GM didn't stop at technical studies. To truly make a statement, they needed a car that wasn't just an experiment hidden in a lab. They needed a rolling symbol of the future. Enter Harley Earl, the legendary head of GM's styling department. Earl wasn't just a designer, he was a showman. He believed cars should inspire dreams, stir emotions, and project visions of tomorrow. For the Firebird I, later known internally as the XP-21, Earl took inspiration directly from jet fighters. He imagined a single-seat land vehicle with wings, a tail fin, and a cockpit canopy that would look more at home on a runway than a highway. His goal wasn't subtlety, it was spectacle. The Firebird was designed to make people stop in their tracks and say, "Is that even a car?" But behind the visual drama, there was a serious engineering purpose. GM wanted to answer a bold question. Could a gas turbine actually replace a piston engine in a car? Engineers were tasked with testing whether this technology could deliver smooth, reliable power while remaining light enough and efficient enough for real-world use. Of course, the challenges appeared almost immediately. Turbines are brilliant at producing constant power under heavy loads, but cars demand flexibility. They need instant acceleration, quick throttle response, and the ability to cruise efficiently at varying speeds. The Firebird's turbines suffered from lag, taking precious seconds to spool up before delivering full thrust. Imagine pressing the accelerator and waiting while the turbine screamed to life. That kind of delay might work in an aircraft, but on the road, it was dangerous. Then came the issue of fuel consumption. Gas turbines devour fuel, especially at partial throttle, and the Firebird was no exception. It relied on kerosene and burned it at alarming rates. Even with a large 35-gallon tank, the range was impractical compared to conventional cars of the time. Heat management was another nightmare. The exhaust gases shot out at more than 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to scorch pavement, melt bumpers, or injure bystanders. Engineers had to carefully design the exhaust system and shield surrounding components to prevent catastrophic damage. This extreme heat also raised questions of whether such a car could ever be safe to operate in a city or suburban environment. There was also the problem of braking and control. Unlike piston engines, turbines provide no engine braking, which meant once the Firebird gathered speed, slowing it down was a serious concern. GM experimented with oversized drum brakes mounted externally for better cooling, but they didn't stop there. In true aviation fashion, the Firebird I featured air brake flaps mounted on its wings to help reduce speed at high velocity, a concept that felt more suited to fighter jets than family sedans. Another difficulty was traction. In early test runs, the car spun its wheels uncontrollably when shifting into higher gears, thanks to the sudden surge of turbine torque. Test driver Emmett Conklin discovered this firsthand when he pushed the car past 100 miles per hour, only to feel the tires lose grip as he shifted, forcing him to back off to avoid disaster. These engineering obstacles underscored the truth. While turbines were powerful and futuristic, they simply weren't suited for road cars at the time. Yet none of this diminished GM's determination to showcase the Firebird as a symbol of ambition. The car wasn't designed for dealerships. It wasn't meant for families or commuters. It wasn't even built to compete with Ford, Chrysler, or European sports cars. Instead, it was aimed at the imagination of the public, to convince people that GM was not just building cars, but designing the future. So, the Firebird I stood as a paradox, a machine bristling with innovation but riddled with impracticalities. It was a car that looked unstoppable but couldn't realistically be driven on the road. A car that symbolized progress even as it revealed the limits of technology. And that was exactly the point. GM didn't want perfection, they wanted provocation. They wanted to light up headlines, capture hearts, and position themselves as the company daring enough to chase the impossible. In short, the Firebird I was never about mass production. It was about vision. It was about pushing the boundaries of what an automobile could be, and showing the world that in the 1950s, the future of driving might not sound like a rumbling V8. It might sound like the scream of a jet engine. If the Firebird I was a vision of the future, its technical details made that vision feel even more extraordinary. On paper, the car was a masterpiece of experimentation, packed with numbers and features that sounded like they belonged to an aircraft, not an automobile.
At its heart lay the Whirlfire Turbo-Power GT-302 engine, a gas turbine specially designed for this project. Unlike piston engines that rely on cylinders and combustion strokes, the turbine operated more like a jet engine. Air was compressed, mixed with fuel, ignited, and expelled to spin a turbine that delivered power. The GT-302 produced an estimated 370 horsepower, impressive for the early 1950s, but what really astonished people was the sheer speed at which its components operated. The gasifier turbine spun at up to 26,000 revolutions per minute, while the power turbine ran at 13,000 RPM. These were astronomical figures compared to the few thousand RPMs of a conventional car engine. The power was sent to the rear wheels through a two-speed planetary transmission. This gearbox had to be designed specifically to cope with the unusual torque characteristics of a turbine, which delivers power differently than a piston engine. While piston engines provide torque across a curve, a turbine surges with power as it spools and then maintains thrust more steadily. The result was explosive acceleration once the turbine reached its peak, but awkward hesitation in normal driving conditions. The Firebird I was relatively light for its radical design. Weighing around 2,500 to 2,800 pounds with a 100-inch wheelbase, it was comparable in size to a sports car of the era. But unlike anything else on the road, it carried a 35-gallon kerosene fuel tank up front, feeding the turbine like an airplane. Fuel consumption was astronomical, far worse than any V8 of the day, which meant even that large tank could empty quickly.
Then there was the issue of heat. The exhaust gases shot out at a staggering 1,250 degrees Fahrenheit. This was hot enough to melt asphalt, scorch nearby objects, and even pose a danger to anyone standing behind the car. It was a detail that fascinated the press, but also underscored just how impractical a turbine-powered automobile truly was. GM engineers worked to shield the car and direct the exhaust safely, but the public quickly realized this was not something you could ever park in your garage. Yet, the technical innovations didn't stop at the engine. The Firebird I was also an aerodynamic study. Its fiberglass-reinforced body was shaped like no other car before it. A sharp nose, delta wings, a tall vertical stabilizer, and a bubble canopy inspired directly by fighter aircraft like the Douglas Skyray. GM even tested the car's body in the wind tunnel at Caltech, refining airflow, downforce, and stability at high speed. This was decades before aerodynamics became a mainstream concern in production cars. To manage braking, GM engineers went even further into aviation territory. Because turbines don't provide natural engine braking, the Firebird I was fitted with oversized external drum brakes for cooling and stopping power. But in a futuristic twist, it also used air brake flaps on its wings, just like a jet slowing down on a runway. The idea of deploying aerodynamic surfaces to stop a car was unheard of in the 1950s and made the Firebird feel more like an aircraft experiment than an automobile. When the car finally debuted at GM's Motorama show in 1954, it created a sensation. Crowds swarmed to see what looked like a jet fighter with wheels. The bubble canopy gleamed under the lights, the tail fins soared upward, and the idea of a turbine-powered car captured imaginations instantly. Newspapers and magazines wrote glowing features, often placing the Firebird in the same context as rockets and supersonic planes. But the excitement was mixed with skepticism. The public loved the spectacle, but understood the limitations. Ordinary drivers recognized that this was not a car they would ever see in a dealership. Fuel economy, extreme heat, lagging acceleration, and the lack of practicality made it clear that the Firebird was more of a technological showpiece than a roadmap to production. Even so, the Firebird accomplished exactly what GM intended. It made headlines, it cemented Harley Earl's reputation as a pioneer of futuristic automotive design, and it positioned General Motors as the company willing to push boundaries. Other automakers had experimented with turbines, like Rover in the UK, but none had packaged it with such dramatic styling or presented it boldly to the public. Test drives only added to the mystique. Emmett Conklin, one of GM's test engineers, managed to push the car to around 100 miles per hour before wheel spin forced him to back off. Later, legendary driver Maury Rose, a three-time Indianapolis 500 winner, was lined up to test it, but GM eventually forbade high-speed runs to avoid accidents. The company realized the car's risks were as spectacular as its appearance. In terms of production numbers, the reality was simple. Only one Firebird I was ever built. It had no sales price, no dealership presence, and no production line. But in the court of public opinion, it didn't matter. The Firebird I had already achieved what every concept car dreams of. It became unforgettable. People loved its futuristic shape, the canopy cockpit, and the sheer audacity of running a gas turbine on the road. At the same time, they mocked its flaws: dangerous exhaust heat, thirsty fuel appetite, and complete lack of practicality. Yet, those flaws only added to the legend, because they reinforce the Firebird's role as a symbol of imagination, not reality. Ultimately, the Firebird I was a paradox, technically advanced but functionally useless, wildly futuristic yet deeply impractical. And that paradox is exactly what made it stand out. It wasn't just a car. It was a glimpse into a world that might have been. A bold statement from General Motors that in the 1950s, the future of the automobile could look and sound like a jet fighter streaking down the highway. The Firebird I may have been a one-off experiment, but its story didn't end with the Motorama of 1954. In fact, its true significance only grew with time. What began as an engineering exercise and a dramatic showpiece slowly transformed into one of the most iconic concept cars in history. For General Motors, the Firebird I became the foundation of a trilogy. It was followed by the Firebird II in 1956 and the Firebird III in 1959, each one refining the idea of turbine propulsion and introducing new concepts like heat regenerators, four-passenger layouts, and even joystick controls. But the Firebird I was the trailblazer, the car that set the stage for these ambitious experiments. Its impact wasn't measured in sales figures or production numbers, it was measured in inspiration. Today, only one Firebird I exists, preserved in pristine condition at the GM Heritage Center in Sterling Heights, Michigan. There, surrounded by other milestones of automotive history, it serves as a reminder of a time when automakers dared to push boundaries with almost reckless imagination. Occasionally, GM brings the Firebird I out of the archives for special displays or events. Each time it appears, it captures the spotlight as though no other car in the room exists. Its white fuselage, towering fin, and jet cockpit still turn heads, proving that its design has lost none of its ability to astonish. But what about its value? That's where the Firebird I becomes unique. Unlike rare Ferraris or Bugattis that appear at auctions, the Firebird I has never been sold and likely never will be. It is a priceless artifact, a piece of GM's heritage that transcends monetary value. If it were ever auctioned, experts agree the price would reach into the tens of millions, not because of performance or collectability, but because it is literally irreplaceable. For collectors, owning the Firebird I is simply impossible. The closest they can get is acquiring scale models or commissioning replicas inspired by its design. Among car enthusiasts, the Firebird I is often spoken of in the same breath as other legendary concept cars like the Chrysler Turbine car or the Buick Yi-Job. But unlike those, which had limited production runs or were used by families for testing, the Firebird I remains a pure prototype, a singular vision that never had to compromise with reality. That purity is part of its magic. It represents not what cars were, but what cars could have been in the wildest dreams of 1950s engineers and designers. Its legacy also extends into popular culture and motorsports. The Firebird I inspired the creation of the Harley Earl Trophy, awarded every year to the winner of the Daytona 500. Look closely at the trophy and you'll see a miniature replica of the Firebird mounted on top, a fitting tribute to a car that embodied speed, daring, and futuristic vision. That connection keeps the Firebird alive in the collective memory of racing fans, even those who might not know its full story. The Firebird I's test history also adds to its legend. During early runs, GM engineer Emmett Conklin managed to push the car to 100 miles per hour before wheel spin forced him to ease off, proving just how volatile turbine torque could be on rubber tires. Later, three-time Indianapolis 500 champion Maury Rose was brought in to test it, but GM, fearing a catastrophic accident, restricted high-speed trials. The car was simply too experimental, too unpredictable to unleash at full power. These anecdotes make the Firebird feel even more mythical, a machine with untapped potential that was never truly pushed to its limits.
There are smaller curiosities, too, that fascinate enthusiasts. For example, the Firebird I's bubble canopy could trap heat inside the cockpit, making it almost unbearable to sit in under the sun, a problem aircraft engineers knew well. The car's exhaust was so dangerously hot that GM had to warn spectators to keep their distance during demonstrations. Even its name, Firebird, was prophetic. It later became one of Pontiac's most famous badges, though on far more practical muscle cars. So, how is the Firebird I seen today? It is less a car and more a symbol. For purists, it represents the pinnacle of Harley Earl's design philosophy, cars as dreams made tangible. For engineers, it is a reminder of both the promise and the pitfalls of turbine technology. And for enthusiasts, it is a piece of automotive mythology, proof that the 1950s were an era when anything felt possible, and when carmakers were willing to gamble on imagination itself. In the end, the Firebird I's greatest value isn't in its horsepower, or its speed, or even its rarity. Its value lies in its story. It showed that innovation isn't always about practicality. Sometimes it's about daring to create something so outrageous, so visionary, that it leaves a permanent mark on history. The Firebird I was never meant to take over America's highways, but it did succeed in conquering something greater, our imagination. The Firebird I proves that sometimes the boldest ideas aren't meant to be practical, they're meant to inspire. And that's exactly why cars like this continue to fascinate us decades later. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think of GM's jet-powered experiment? Would you have dared to drive it? And most importantly, what classic or concept car should I cover next? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed diving into this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications bell so you don't miss the next deep dive, and of course, like and share this video with fellow car enthusiasts. Together, we're building a community of people who live and breathe automotive history. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.